Hello and welcome. You're watching a World Panorama, your one-stop show for all the big international news stories that unfolded this week. I'm Aishwarya Kapoor with you. Let us start the program with the top headlines. Nations supporting and funding terrorism must be called out, asserts Prime Minister Modi at the SCO summit, which is for better economic ties with the SCO countries. Holds several bilaterals on the sidelines of the summit. Hong Kong boils as protests over a controversial China extradition bill turn violent. Bill would allow fugitives to be extradited to the mainland China. Protesters say it impinges on Hong Kong's autonomy. Tensions between US and Iran soar. Washington accuses Iran for Gulf of Oman tanker attacks. Iran refutes claims. Nuclear watchdog IAEA says Tehran has increased the production of enriched uranium that is used for producing nuclear energy. Sudan's military and opposition groups agree to resume talks on formation of a civilian government. The talks between the two sides had collapsed after sit-in protest on 3rd of June saw violence in which more than 60 protesters were killed. And Kazakhstan elects Tokayev as new president. Vote was overshadowed by the arrests of more than 500 protesters. Nazarbayev stepped down in March after decades in power. The top story this week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Kyrgyz capital for the two-day SCO summit. The SCO is a China-led 8-member economic and security bloc to which India and Pakistan were admitted in 2017. In his address to the grouping of member countries, Prime Minister Modi sent a stern message to Pakistan, saying that the countries sponsoring, aiding and supporting terrorism must be held accountable. Underscoring the aim of the SCO to strengthen cooperation in the fight against terrorism, PM Modi called for a global conference to combat it. He added that the countries will have to come out of their narrow purview to unite against terrorism to fight it. PM Modi also held several bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the summit, but there was no meeting with the Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan, though the two leaders did exchange pleasantries on day 2 of the summit. The heads of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries descended on Bishkek for the group's 19th Leader Summit on 14th of June. Taking part in the summit, this was Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first multilateral engagement post his re-election. For India, twin issues of terrorism and regional connectivity were the focus areas.
Excellency, भारत में चुनाव नतीजे के बाद आपका मुझे संदेश मिला और आज दोबारा आपने मुझे बधाई दी। मैं इसके लिए आपका बहुत बहुत आभारी हूँ। और जैसा आपने कहा, आपके साथ आने वाले दिनों में मिल करके बहुत सारे विषयों में हम आगे बढ़ सकते हैं।
On the first day of his visit, Modi held delegation-level talks with the top leadership of Afghanistan, China and Russia on the sidelines of the summit. During his talks with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, there was a discussion on an inclusive peace process in the conflict-hit nation. PM Modi, in his meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin, reviewed all aspects of bilateral relations to further boost the strategic relationship. And in his talks with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Modi reiterated India's stand that Pakistan should take concrete action against terror before talks can resume. The Prime Minister also applauded China's help in declaring Masood Azhar as a global terrorist. The Chinese President also accepted Prime Minister Modi's invitation to visit India later this year for an informal summit.
Prime Minister in fact said that we have a consistent position with respect to Pakistan. We discuss all issues through a bilateral mechanism and we look for peaceful settlement through negotiation. We are committed to this process. The Prime Minister recalled that he has made efforts in this regard and these efforts have been derailed. the Prime Minister did inform President Xi Jinping that Pakistan needs to create an atmosphere free of terrorism, and that at this stage we did not see this as happening as yet, and that therefore we expect Pakistan to take concrete action on the issues that India has proposed, in the areas of concern that we have flagged to Pakistan, that Pakistan should take concrete action in this regard.
However, there was no meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Pakistani counterpart Imran Khan amidst frosty Indo-Pak relations. In fact, in a snub, PM Modi did not use Pakistani airspace on his way to Bishkek. Also, at an informal dinner hosted by Kyrgyzstan President for the leaders attending the SCO summit on Thursday, PM Modi and Imran Khan did not even exchange pleasantries. In his address at the plenary session, PM Modi again articulated India's position on dealing with major challenges facing the region, including the rising threat of terrorism.
पिछले रविवार श्रीलंका की अपनी यात्रा के दौरान मैं सेंट एंटनी में एक चर्च गया था। वहां मुझे आतंकवाद के उस घिनौने चेहरे का स्मरण हुआ जो हर कहीं कभी भी प्रकट होकर रोज मासूमों की जान लेता है। इस खतरे से निपटने के सभी मानवतावादी ताकतों को अपने अपने संकीर्ण दायरे से निकलकर एकजुट हो जाना चाहिए। आतंकवाद को प्रोत्साहन, समर्थन और वित्त प्रदान करने वाले राष्ट्रों को जिम्मेदार ठहराना जरूरी है। एससीओ सदस्यों को आतंकवाद का सफाया करने के लिए एससीओ रेड्स के तहत सहयोग की पूरी क्षमता का इस्तेमाल करना चाहिए। भारत आतंकवाद से निपटने के लिए एक अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर के सम्मेलन का आह्वान करता है।
The Prime Minister also held delegation-level talks with the top leadership of Kazakhstan, Belarus and Mongolia. He also held bilateral talks with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, with the talks focusing on how India and Iran intend to move forward on the oil sanctions imposed on Iran by the US. The Prime Minister also inaugurated the India-Kyrgyz Business Forum along with the President of Kyrgyzstan and held delegation-level talks with him. Formerly the Shanghai Five and formed in 1996, the grouping was named SCO in 2001, with China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan as its founding members. It has 8 members today. India and Pakistan became part of it in 2017. Since its formation, the SCO has focused on regional security with counter-terrorism as a priority. The fight against the 3 evils of terrorism, separatism and extremism has become its mantra. Today, areas of cooperation also include themes such as economics and culture. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. The authorities in Hong Kong shut some government offices in the heart of the city on Friday after mass protests against a controversial bill that would allow the extradition of people to mainland China. Hong Kong City saw its worst violence on Wednesday as police and demonstrators had pitched battles during protests in the city. Now, despite the widespread opposition, the government has not backed down. However, Hong Kong's Legislative Council delayed a debate of the controversial extradition bill, and it is unclear when it will take place. The debate was originally scheduled for Wednesday. Thousands of demonstrators pouring into streets surrounding Hong Kong's legislature on Wednesday morning, as the legislature was to debate over a controversial extradition bill. Some protesters wore face masks and helmets and blocked key roads with barricades and human chains. Thousands of protesters were seen at several other government buildings as well. There were standoffs with the police at various places. Police used pepper spray to disperse them. However, as the turnout swelled, the government abruptly postponed the planned debate over the extradition law.
Actually, at first we thought the march might have some power to voice out to the government, but this act is actually showing that they did not think, they don't care about our voices. It's really sad.
Hong Kong has boiled over into massive protests in recent days as the government attempts to fast-track the controversial bill that would, for the first time, allow fugitives to be sent to mainland China. The bill has ignited fears about Hong Kong's continued autonomy. Despite widespread opposition, Hong Kong's leader says she will continue to push for the bill.
I call on schools, parents, institutions, corporations, unions to consider seriously if they advocate these radical actions and what kind of benefits it will bring to the Hong Kong society.
The latest attempts to paralyze Hong Kong through acts of civil disobedience recall the pro-democracy demonstrations that shook the city during 2014's Umbrella Movement. That uprising began with calls to occupy Central, and Wednesday's sit-in around the legislature is being dubbed Occupy 2.0. Chinese media has blamed Hong Kong demonstrations on collusion with West, and Beijing claims it has made certain amendments to the bill.
The Military Council has agreed on building trust between parties. In doing so, the Council has agreed to release all political prisoners. From the side of the opposition, it has shown its willingness and has agreed to suspend the civil disobedience.
It is noteworthy that Hong Kong was a British colony. Its sovereignty was returned to China in 1997. Central to the handover was the agreement of the Basic Law, a mini-constitution that gives Hong Kong broad autonomy and sets out certain rights. Under the one country, two systems principle, Hong Kong has kept its judicial independence, its own legislature, its economic system and the Hong Kong dollar. But Hong Kong residents feel that it is their autonomy that is time and again being suppressed by the Chinese government. Bureau Report, Rajesh Bhatti. And United Nations nuclear watchdog IAEA has expressed concerns about increasing tensions over Iran's nuclear deal. Now, it says that since US withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran, the country has increased the production of enriched uranium, the type of uranium that is used for producing nuclear energy. Now, the warning comes as Tehran appears poised to break the 2015 nuclear deal that it had struck with the world powers. Iran has demanded that the 5 remaining parties to the nuclear deal, namely Germany, the UK, France, China and Russia, save the deal and help it evade US sanctions, or else it would consider leaving the accord after 60 days. Is Iran building a nuclear weapon? The world suspects so and is worried. The head of the global nuclear watchdog IAEA recently confirmed Iran is increasing its production of enriched uranium. International Atomic Energy Agency IAEA is the body responsible for verifying Iran's compliance with its obligations under the 2015 nuclear deal. IAEA did not specify the amount of uranium production increased by Iran and also when the stockpile limit would be exceeded that was set in the 2015 deal, but said it was worried.
Since then, has Iran made good on any of its announcements in terms of increasing its production of uranium?
Yes. The production rate is increasing. It is clear that the tension is increasing. So it is good to reduce the tension.
Iran agreed to restrictions to its uranium production in the 2015 nuclear accord that was signed by the world powers, including the US. However, US President Donald Trump abandoned the nuclear deal last year and reinstated sanctions on Iran. He also announced sanctions for countries that continued buying oil from Iran. Angered by the US's move, Iran announced that it was rolling back some restrictions under the deal. That means it would no longer comply with the caps on its stockpiles of enriched uranium, which is used to make nuclear reactor fuel, but also nuclear weapons. Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif has called it an economic war.
The new tension in our region, the Middle East, is the result of the economic war that the United States is waging against Iran. The only way to reduce tension in the region is to put a stop to this economic war.
Iran has also given the 5 other states that are still party to the nuclear deal, Germany, the UK, France, China and Russia,
until 7th of July to protect Iranian oil sales from US sanctions. Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif held talks this week with his visiting German counterpart Heiko Maas and emphasized European powers must help preserve the nuclear deal.
Germany's position and of our French and British friends is very clear. We'll stick to the JCPOA nuclear deal, and we also want to implement our obligation from the JCPOA. We'll do everything in our power to ward off a breakdown.
Washington's European allies opposed its decision to abandon the nuclear deal. They have promised to help Iran find other ways to trade, though with no success so far. All major European companies that had announced plans to invest in Iran have since called them off for fear of US punishment. Tensions meanwhile keep rising between Iran and the US. Recently, Washington sent more military forces to the Middle East in a show of force against what US calls Iranian threats to US troops and interests in the region. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And continuing with the US-Iran tension story, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe arrived in Iran on Wednesday on a two-day trip that was aimed at cooling tensions in the region. And then things blew up. On Thursday, two tankers carrying petrochemicals, one of which was a Japanese-owned ship, came under attack in the Gulf of Oman. The US blamed the incident in the world's most pivotal maritime corridor on Tehran. The US military also released a video which it says shows the Iran's Revolutionary Guard removing an unexploded mine from the side of an oil tanker that was damaged in the attack. The US officials also shared a photo of the Japanese tanker apparently showing the unexploded mine before it was removed. However, Iran said that it categorically rejects the allegations. The blast came a month after 4 oil tankers were damaged in an attack off the coast of UAE. The US had blamed Iran for that attack as well, but did not produce any evidence. Iran denied the accusations. And on to the other top story this week. Sudan's military and opposition groups have agreed to resume talks on the formation of a civilian government. The talks between the two sides had collapsed after a sit-in protest on 3rd of June saw violence in which more than 60 protesters were killed. Sudan's military took power in April after months-long popular uprising led to the overthrow of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. But the protests continued with the demand for democracy in the country. And now there is a hope for that, with the military and the opposition groups set to resume talks.
The African Union on Thursday suspended Sudan, saying that the country will stay out until there was a civilian rule. The move has intensified global pressure on Sudan's new military leaders to stand down after the worst violence since Omar al-Bashir's fall in April.
We strongly condemn and lament the tragic and unjustified loss of life, and reminding the transitional authorities in Sudan of its obligation to protect civilians and respect their rights. We insist on the need for an investigation that will clarify the events that took place on the 3rd of June in Sudan, with a view of bringing those responsible for the killings of innocent Sudanese people to justice.
The unrest in Sudan began in December last year. There was anger over rising bread prices and cash shortages. Sustained protests culminated in the army ousting Bashir in April. However, the protests did not die down, as people, spearheaded by the opposition, demanded a civilian rule. They continued their protests, but on 3rd of June, soldiers raided one of the protest camps in Khartoum at dawn. Soldiers who outnumbered the crowds there opened fire on protesters who, as they tried to flee, screamed and stumbled on makeshift barricades. The opposition says 108 people died in violence, but Sudan's health ministry put the toll at 61 people. The violence invited criticism globally.
The Secretary General strongly condemns the violence and reports of the excessive force used by security personnel on civilians that have resulted in the deaths and injury of many. He condemns the use of force to disperse the protesters at the sit-in site.
The violence also led to collapsing of talks between Sudan's military and opposition groups over a civilian-led transition to democracy. However, now with international pressure and mediation by Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the two sides have agreed to resume talks. Opposition also promised to suspend its protests. Ethiopia is mediating the talks. A US diplomat also met the opposition to facilitate a dialogue.
The military council has agreed on building trust between parties. In doing so, the council has agreed to release all political prisoners. From the side of the opposition, it has shown its willingness and has agreed to suspend the civil disobedience.
As talks begin, the opposition issued a statement urging people to return to work. As a result, shops and services that were shut down have started to reopen, mostly among small businesses and daily wage earners who could not afford to remain closed. All eyes are on the talks, people wondering if they will usher in democracy in the country. But will the military cede power to a civilian government? Let's wait and watch. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And here is a look at some more international news stories in Global Buzz. There are concerns over latest outbreak of Ebola in Central Africa. Nearly 1,400 people have died in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The epidemic was the worst since that of 2013-16 and has showed no signs of stopping. A 5-year-old boy has also died in neighboring Uganda, the first case of Ebola reported in the country. The outbreak is the second largest in the history of the disease, with a significant spike in new cases in recent weeks. The main suspect in the Christchurch attacks in March has pleaded not guilty to all charges. Brenton Tarrant is charged with the murder of 51 people, 40 counts of attempted murder and one terrorism charge in New Zealand's deadliest peacetime mass shooting. Appearing via video link from prison, the 28-year-old Australian sat silently as his lawyer read out his plea. The 15th of March attack saw the gunman opening fire on Muslims during Friday prayers. This is the first time that a terrorism charge has been brought in New Zealand. Boris Johnson has secured the highest number of votes in the first MP's ballot to select the Conservative Party leader and next British Prime Minister. 3 contenders were knocked out in the secret ballot of Tory MPs. Boris Johnson received 114 votes, significantly more than his nearest rival Jeremy Hunt, who came second with 43. Michael Gove was third with 37. 7 candidates progressed to the next round of voting next week, and the winner of the contest to succeed Theresa May is expected to be announced in the week of 22nd of July. Ruled by the same authoritarian leader since the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan finally has a new president. The election results released on Monday confirmed the victory of the old order's hand-picked candidates. Results from Sunday's vote showed that KJ Tokayev, the governing party's chosen successor to President Nursultan Nazarbayev, had won 70.7% of the vote, far ahead of his nearest rival. However, the vote was marred by thousands of detentions, and the election was announced as unfair by observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
Kazakhstan has elected interim leader Kassym-Jomart Tokayev as the new president. Results showed Tokayev, a career diplomat, getting 70.7% of the votes polled. His closest rival, Amirzan Kosanov, got only 16%.
Tokayev is a loyalist and the hand-picked successor of long-term former President Nursultan Nazarbayev, who resigned in March.
Kazim Zomat Kamlaevich Tokayev has got 65,04,054 votes or 70.76% of votes.
The election on Sunday was marred by detentions. Around 500 people were detained, including a number of Kazakh and foreign journalists. Besides, hundreds of people were also arrested on Sunday while protesting against what they call was staged managed election, which they say would deprive them of a political voice. There were protests in Nur Sultan, the country's capital, formerly known as Astana, and the country's main commercial city, Almaty. The protesters allege election was staged to put in office a politician loyal to Nazarbayev. There were clashes during the protests, after which people were taken into custody. The election was also denounced as unfair by observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Human Rights Watch also called the prospect of a genuine political transition an illusion.
Today, having observed the entire election process so far, we can conclude that a lack of respect for fundamental freedoms and widespread voting irregularities on election day left the potential for political reform untapped.
The lopsided result and heavy-handed police action on Sunday against protesters has been denounced by the critics. They say while the country's veteran leader Nazarbayev has relinquished the presidency, the system he established during his 28 years in office remains firmly in place. It is noteworthy that Nazarbayev led Kazakhstan since its separation from the Soviet Union in 1991. The resignation of the 78-year-old leader came as a surprise to many who expected him to run for re-election next year. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
That's all in this edition of the program. But before we go, here is a look at a celebration of fruits. Yes, indeed. Visitors have been going bananas over Los Angeles' newest pop-up museum, World of Fruit. The exhibition celebrates all things fruity with 8 interactive installations from a room filled with the giant pink-spotted banana segments to another with watermelon-themed swings and seesaws. Visitors are also invited to try various fresh and exotic fruits at tasting stations throughout the exhibition. And the best part is that the museum donates a portion of all the ticket sales towards providing fruit and food for people in need. So take a look at the world of fruits. As I take your leave, I'll see you next week with another edition of World Panorama. Bye-bye.